he said there was lots of corruption in the RCMP and throughout Canadian police. He said he knew that Iranian actors, I believe, had what he called exquisite visibility into the Toronto police radio room.
Thanks very much for joining us again, Sam. It's great to have you here.
Great to be back. Enjoyed the last time.
Me too. So I think what's a lot of people are wondering, especially myself selfishly, is any kind of update on the Toronto police corruption. There's been nothing on it in the media, many arrests, I think 11 or 12 arrests across a couple different agencies there, Peel and Toronto. Can you update the audience on what's gone on there and the connections with the cartel and how that unraveled?
Yeah, my last reporting from the Bureau picked up on there actually was some decent reporting from Toronto media. I believe the CBC picked up on one of the court hearings that I can't attend as I'm not in Toronto, and there was a no contact list for I believe the main accused in this case, someone named DaCosta, who allegedly all that they would say in the press conference, if you remember that, memorable that top police officials were wearing bulletproof vests. They came out and said that this DaCosta has significant international connections. And even from that first press conference, I took that to mean Mexican cartels and Ryan Wedding, because my reporting at the Bureau, based mostly from US government sources that were very disappointed in Canadian police cooperation on all the cartel operations coming into Canada, that is using Indo-Canadian trucking companies to bring up massive loads of meth and coke from the cartels up through the states, California, Texas, into Ontario mostly. That case, or my knowledge, was that Ryan Wedding was said to be, and his networks were said to have control or rather facilitation or brokerage relationships with every piece of cartel product coming up into Canada. And I'm not sure if that's exactly true, but it's largely true. I think that he was the guy that has the connections to the domestic gangs across Canada. And so I saw the indications that his networks, I believed, had to be involved in that Toronto case, because it's his networks that were behind all these failed cases in Ontario that I've detailed, from something called Project Brisa, all cocaine coming up on Indo-Canadian long haul trucks into Toronto. There was a massive press conference in 2023, and that case just fell apart. As I've been reporting, Canada can't prosecute them. And there was another one called Project Pelican in the Peel Regional Police. And so in a roundabout way, I'm saying I knew that Ryan Wedding, his networks were part of the funnel feeding the drugs into this Toronto network that had corrupted a number of Toronto officers. We don't know how many. And especially, the key point was that some of these Toronto officers used databases to target a Canadian jail official in a major Toronto jail that was, this jail official was doing his job by blocking drugs coming into the facility. And for that, he was targeted for homicide. So cut to the chase here, this no contact list for DaCosta included I believe dozens of names, and one of them was someone that was on the Ryan Wedding indictment, one of these Indo-Canadian truckers. So, and I believe potentially, from what I read and reported, involved in the schemes in that Ontario jailhouse sort of operations. And I don't have updates beyond that. There were some officers named, I believe, from Peel as well, that have come up in the corruption probe. And not much has developed in court, except that I believe the Indo-Canadian lawyer who was named in the Ryan Wedding indictment, who we know from the US government filings, allegedly was the one that hooked Ryan Wedding up with Indo-Canadian mafia trucking networks. and helped in the counseling of, a US government witness for murder. So connecting those dots, not much has come out in court, but I'm seeing the indications of Ryan Wedding, the indications of lethality towards government witnesses, a government official in Ontario, and that to me spells cartel violence and Ryan Wedding.
That's pretty wild. I don't think that's a leap in logic at all to get to where you to put those pieces together. And it sounds quite literally like there's a trail of evidence with these names appearing on these court documents. So just to clarify for anybody who's not sort of read in on this or up to date, the Toronto police were potentially, allegedly, we'll say, passing information to cartel members in order to target a corrections officer who was trying to enforce sort of quote unquote law and order within the penitentiary of reducing the drug trafficking in, or whatever, you know what I mean, the currency that moves prison sort of underground. And that's the connection here between the cartel and the alleged assassination attempt on this corrections officer.
Yeah, like I'll add a little more context. So there's something like 8 to 10 Toronto police officers named in this conspiracy that the York Regional Police, as an external agency, were brought in to investigate. Some of them were alleged to be hands-on involved in cocaine trafficking, fentanyl trafficking. Some of the officers, it looked like I believe a 50-year-old TPS, Toronto Police Services member, was alleged to be the one that accessed the identity and home address of this jailhouse official, who it later came out in reporting was targeted by, let's just call it, the cartel proxies in Toronto. So this man, Brian DaCosta, and others in his network would be the ones who were allegedly targeting an Ontario official for doing their job and stopping cartel drugs from coming into the jail facility. So there's a lot of allegations. A lot of them stem off illegally, accessing police databases and sharing information out to very violent, let's just call them, if they're not, bikers, cartel proxies, Ryan Wedding type associates, Indo-Canadian trucking networks. There's a whole potpourri of bad people involved, allegedly, if we're talking about the Toronto Police Services corruption case. Another big deal was, they found this main accused with a lot of fentanyl in his possession, which was said to be bound for Europe. As you know, there's been a lot of sort of denialism, I say, in Ottawa, that slowly Canada has recognized it has a lab problem of producing fentanyl. A lot of people are dying. And I say, since the Mark Carney government has come in, there's been a line, I believe, coming down from his office that, okay, we'll now admit that Canada is producing fentanyl, but none of it's going to the United States. So in this case, yeah, a lot of it was said to be going to Europe, which probably, I'll leave it at that. I wouldn't doubt it if the same networks are sending it across the border to Buffalo or, through the Mohawk lands, into New York State, because that's what they do. But another interesting point in the case was that these Toronto police officers were allegedly providing protection to an illegal marijuana dispensary service run, or shops run by the main accused in this case. And so, again, that's a point that I like to stress. A lot of people think marijuana is legal now, and it is in Canada. But I say that, the Ryan Weddings of the world, the Hells Angels, these gangs that are working and embedded on Indigenous reserves, all of them are sort of below the Chinese triads and the Mexican cartels, who have taken advantage and taken over, Canada's soft marijuana business, all the legal licenses. And, I think, again, this Toronto police corruption case shows it. This man was bringing in coke and meth from offshore. They didn't say Mexico, but of course it's from Mexico. He was, it looks like, producing fentanyl in Ontario, sending it abroad, but also running marijuana shops. So that just shows how I say marijuana was basically used to roll out the architecture for the synthetic narcotics that are now exploding out of Canada. So people need to understand, it's not just love love tunes and marijuana that make Canada great. It's the worst of the world's organized crime have taken advantage of the way we've been sort of soft, you could say, on marijuana.
So just a quick recap to keep up with all that there. So the Toronto police, at least possibly, if not likely, are connected to Ryan Wedding indirectly through, or directly through the cartels that are now more or less running at least part of the drug trade underneath the CCP, the triads, and that whole thing. And then there's the Iranian connection via Ryan's wife is Iranian, and then potential links of her or her family to this in the background. Can you shed some light on that?
Yeah. Okay. I'll jump over to Ryan Wedding's former wife and her connections. Let me just touch on Ontario again, because there's an even more concrete sort of data point that illuminates what we've just been talking about. But I covered the Cameron Ortis trial in depth in Ottawa, and he was convicted on some of the charges. Some of the stuff he was accused of couldn't even be heard in court because it endangered national interests or security or secrets. But what that case revealed was Wedding was allegedly selling U.S. government targeting and intelligence to Hezbollah, to Iranian actors in Toronto, to the Sinaloa cartel, who, including, people working for Chapo to run encryption technology companies in Vancouver. And on the Iranian piece that you're looking for, something very interesting in the Ortis case that came out was, he was denying everything that he was accused of. He's been convicted of sort of trying to sell Canadian and US police plans to the worst of Iranian state actors in Toronto, responsible for massive money laundering. But he, acknowledged in his own defense, when he was on the stand, he said, look, I'm accused of certain things. I've got a story that I was actually running like a secret operation to try to target these people that I was working with. That's his sort of dog ate my homework excuse that no one buys. But, he said there was lots of corruption in the RCMP and throughout Canadian police. He said he knew that Iranian actors, I believe, had what he called exquisite visibility into the Toronto police radio room. So this was years ago, and he was already pointing to deep penetration of Middle Eastern networks into police in Ontario. And so when this Toronto Police Services case has come up, I think it was just confirming what this senior Canadian police official was already pointing to. So that was an interesting trial where a lot, just sitting there every day, I could see that Canadian justice was very carefully trying to prosecute this man while sort of hiving off a lot of the secrets around him that pointed to other vulnerabilities within Canadian police and beyond. So jumping into the Ryan Wedding Iranian piece, my assessment, and I'm working more and more on writing about Ryan Wedding and what his case means to Canada. My strong assessment is that, he was in his athletic career, in his snowboarding, he very likely sort of got into the marijuana culture in British Columbia in his high school days. He was obviously an amazingly talented athlete, but he was also a BC boy. And it's not a big stretch for snowboarders to be involved in the marijuana culture. And as he sort of started to phase out of his athletic career, after appearing in the Olympics, maybe even before, he did get into marijuana dealing. He went to jail. And when he was in jail, at that point, he had dabbled, I believe, in cocaine. He got he got done down in the United States, which is the worst thing for a Canadian drug deal to happen because it's pretty difficult for them to get caught in Canada. While in jail, somehow someone hooked him up with an Iranian Canadian woman in Toronto. And there's all kinds of court reporting on this woman's involvement in a case that had a brutal sort of extortion, uh, major underground banking related to Iranian transporter money laundering systems, which are very similar to the Chinese underground banking systems that I've detailed. This is the way that money can move across borders without going through a bank. Drug cash can be scattered all over the world, and you just need people at a high level in sort of an Iranian or Chinese network to make arrangements for different people to sort of adjust debits and credits. And what that means is, if I've dealt some drugs from Vancouver down to Los Angeles, I can very easily, through underground Iranian networks, make my money collected, wherever the drugs are sold, and move it back to where I want it, and then get it laundered into a bank. So this woman involved in a case, the one case that I know, it doesn't even mention Ryan Wedding, but the people involved in the violence in that case would just look like your standard, wannabe up and coming biker gang members, or in British Columbia, the gangs are called the United Nations or the Red Scorpions or the Independent Soldiers. These are sort of, the street gangs of, they will look like young Canadian hockey players. And some of them are. They're the ones that are moving a lot of drugs in Canada. There's something like 700 gangs across the country now. This is the type of social networks that Ryan Wedding came up in. But until he makes that connection with that Iranian Canadian woman, in jail, he doesn't get up into those upper echelons of being a cartel operator. And that speaks to, what I know, that it's the Mexican cartels working hand in hand with actors from Hezbollah, actors from the IRGC, the Iranian Guards, and above them, sometimes even at an insulated distance, the CCP members. So that's what I say, why, Ryan Wedding is obviously a hell of a smart guy, a hell of a tough guy, apparently brutal, and unafraid to use violence, lethal. But he wouldn't be where he was without making those connections with the Iranian and Mexican people that take him up to that level. And I'll go a little further. There's some people that, from policing and intelligence that I talk to, that at the end of the day say people like Ryan Wedding, they're a dime a dozen. And, being a hulking sort of, Caucasian guy from British Columbia with an athletic background sure looks like a pretty good front for a Mexican cartel with Iranian state actors aligned to it. So there's a lot of bikers in Canada that are tough guys and wealthy guys now, but they're not transnational actors without those Mexican, Iranian, and Chinese connections.
Wow. There's a lot to unpack there, but that's way deeper than anything I've seen in the Canadian media by any legacy or other news source. So that's pretty wild, and it's gonna keep us entertained for a while on unpacking all that as this thing rolls on. Sort of just pivoting briefly here off topic, like, have you ever considered writing a script or a movie, or this might be the most interesting story in Canadian sort of recent history. Like, this is absolutely almost to the point of being unbelievable, the connections that are being made here. And then this lady is it was his ex-wife that he was connected to via connections in during serving time. He was serving time in Canada in a Canadian jail when this happened.
He was in a Texas jail, and it was Valentine's Day. And again, I give credit where credit's due. I say I'm the leader on this file, but the CBC has done a few good reports. I think they picked up on, how I strongly asserted that Ryan was connected to Hezbollah at the end of the day, and that's what made him important. uh, you know, as I reported, he was running drugs through Margarita Island, which is part of the Maduro narco state operation, which is part of the Sinaloa operation, which is part of the government of Sinaloa operation, as we now know with the recent indictment. So what I'm saying is there's no Ryan Wedding without corruption at the highest levels of Latin American governments. And for all we know, probably a few people corrupted in Canada too. We already know Ryan Wedding's case involves, as I say, running cocaine through Margarita Island, which is just off the coast of Venezuela, along with Hezbollah actors in that area for the Sinaloa cartel, and running it up into the port of Halifax, where his network corrupted individuals connected to the Canadian Navy. So yeah, there's corruption in Canada. But, your question, have I thought about writing more about this? I'll tell you, I'm strongly thinking, and I probably, okay, I'll spill the beans. I'm working on a book that's a natural evolution from Willful Blindness of 2021, and it's looking at Ryan Wedding, and it won't be a surprise for people when they actually read it that, as I say, I mean, the preconditions for a Ryan Wedding, yeah, he may be one in a million, but he doesn't exist unless, for example, Justin Trudeau takes away the Mexican visa requirement and creates a loophole back in 2016. Something that one of my US former government colleagues, David Luna, has pointed to in a major report, speaking to the Ryan Wedding networks and how the bikers have become, the functional operational arm of the Mexican cartels, along with sophisticated Iranian actors and the CCP upstream. So yeah, I mean, sometimes I scramble around in my brain to answer your question, and I got to admit, I'm probably delving into those files that I'm already working on and writing as we speak. I don't know the title of this book, or even if I've lined up. Maybe I'll publish it myself through the Bureau because I've got enough of a platform now, and so I'll put that writing together between two physical covers, and it'll be the story of how Canada has created the conditions for Ryan Wedding and more Ryan Weddings are out there.
Thank you for bringing up the Trudeau piece. I was probably going to get there eventually, but that the visa requirement being dropped by Trudeau, all these the corruption of senior officials, like you said, the Canadian Navy, the Halifax piece, the PNP scandal and PEI, this list just goes on and on and on of almost endless people being bought off, policy changes being greased by who knows. Like, how much of this can any of it be a coincidence? Or like, I'm not saying that Justin Trudeau did this to enable organized crime in Canada, but like, there's pieces in this puzzle that all seem to point to everybody being on the same page. It's hard to imagine 37 coincidences in a row. Eventually it becomes a pattern of intelligence.
Yeah, that's where I am in my mind. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned the Prince Edward Islands immigrant investor program, because the people involved in that, to fill in the blanks for people that don't know the story, my book Willful Blindness was how about partly how Jean Chrétien in his era, opened up a whole stream for people that turned out to be, Chinese organized crime or government adjacent people, super wealthy people from Asia that would, drop a lot of investment in the Shawinigan riding of Jean Chrétien, or his, I guess we could call his successor, Francois Champagne. These people and related law firms in Quebec were a big part of the Quebec immigrant investor program, and that was shut down as a fraud. Untold number of gangsters from China, Hong Kong, Taiwan got in and set up in, a lot of them ended up in Vancouver and Toronto, some in Quebec. And when Quebec's program was shut down and Canada's was revealed to be a fraud and winnowed down, PEI was picked up, and the very same sort of flood of high-level Chinese tycoons, some of them may not be criminal. Some of them very likely are, but they were run through the story as like a little motel. There was dozens of people that set up their business address or some sort of residential ID for their landing as an immigrant through a little motel. So it was very clear that Chinese organized crime with connectivity to senior politicians in Ottawa, Montreal, senior industrialists, senior law firms. These people with massive amounts of money have been flooding into Canada for decades, very strongly since the 1990s. And I assess that it's the upstream Chinese investment into financial entities, real estate, technology, connections to law firms that sets up the money laundering infrastructure at the highest level that facilitates all of the cartel, and the Ryan wedding activity down the chain. And this is not speculation at all. The US government, the US Treasury has sort of done the same reporting that I've done now, saying that Chinese underground banking has taken over the architecture of money laundering for all gangs, but most especially the Latin cartels, which are of most concern in fentanyl, methamphetamine, labs in Mexico and Canada, and dealing that product into the United States. And so I'm talking about underground banking from China being sort of the architecture of this all, but it's worked its way into legal or licit looking finance. So we're talking about real estate developers, law firms, just say supercar dealerships, which is not a big stretch to believe. All manner of Canada's economy, and we can say the big six banks have been involved in sort of mixing that underground banking, pure black dirty money, much of it drug money, human trafficking money, prostitution money, extortion money, mixing it into the legal businesses, including Canada's big banks. And that is both what is making Canada sort of a major weak point in Western Hemisphere money laundering. And it's the point that I think is at the top of Washington's, let's call it, concern list with their concerns with Canada's sitting government. And that gets to your point. Is there sort of a grander strategy or play behind Canada turning a blind eye? That's a tough one. It's hard to prove, but I would assert with 1,000% confidence, because I've heard it from senior former military intelligence, current and former, American intelligence, that it is grand strategy on the part of the Chinese Communist Party to flood foreign nations with dirty money, corruption money, even to weaponize migration into another, democratic system in a way to take over that other nation silently. So this is what the US government says. It's grand strategy from the CCP. And there's no divide between Chinese organized crime and the CCP. They're one and the same thing.
Yeah, and for the audience that may not sort of be tracking this U.S. recognition of the Canadian threat, this is coming from the highest three-letter agencies and the directors of those agencies, that Canada, as a porous security deficient, how many security deficiencies that we have, is now a direct threat to American national security because of the amount of money and drugs and people and everything that's flowing in. And just to backtrack a little bit, like the PNP scandal, for instance, like I think it was $400 million sort of evaporated into the ether that couldn't be accounted for. And then they do an inquiry into trying to look for it, and then no one's arrested. The TD Bank, largest money laundering fraud in the entire world that they were, I guess, deemed guilty of participating in.
Yeah.
Nobody's arrested. Like they had to pay, I think, the largest fine, TD, for doing all this money laundering, but nobody's guilty of anything. I don't like it. It's almost, it seems comically dumb how well that, like, sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah, not to cut you off, but the TD Bank is remains a major irritant for the U.S. government, and so you're right. That was at the last count 3.3 billion, and it's gone up US dollars. So whatever that is, 5 billion Canadian dollars levied against TD in a deferred prosecution in which they acknowledged they were complicit directly in money laundering for Mexican cartels through the Chinese underground bankers. This was the story, and it was proven by the DEA that Chinese international students, so part of China's United Front Work Department system, were the ones that were picking up the drug cash from the underground brokers. That is, these Chinese business persons in New York, Flushing, or New Jersey. That the system is they bid on Mexican cartel fentanyl cash, proceeds of the fentanyl sold to New Yorkers. The brokers bid on those contracts. Chinese international student comes in, walks it into a bank. The money is laundered, all kinds of shell companies. It'll go back to some factory in, Guangdong, which will, pay for something like $10 million worth of washing machines to be shipped over to Sinaloa. And that's how the cartel gets their money back, purely laundered. And the criminals on all sides own, washing machine factories and dispensaries, to use that example. So, yeah, and you're right. Canada did nothing. FinTrack had exquisite intelligence that this was happening in Canada. I did a story in 2024 about a FinTrack study of 50,000 Chinese diaspora banking transactions. So this is exquisite data, population-wide intelligence, and they were showing how this underground banking, they were warning Canadian banks, this is happening to you. So these are the typologies to look for. A student that opens a bank account and starts jamming money in, or a law firm is starting to jam money in. A real estate developer is, taking massive cash transactions. And so that led to me reporting on a major case happening with HSBC because I had a whistleblower. And this totally matched my HSBC story in Canada, Toronto area, matched the kind of mortgage money laundering and, cash, I believe, that the TD Bank case exposed. But nothing happened in Canada. A journalist exposed that. FinTrack knew about it. So that's the Ministry of Finance. But the RCMP, Ministry of Finance, Prime Minister's office, they're not doing anything, right? No, not only does no one go to jail, at the end of the day, after TD was fined the largest amount ever by the US government, they then face something like an $8 million administrative fine in Canada, which the US government just saw as a slap in the face. It's like 8 million compared to whatever it is, 5 billion Canadian is what they faced in the US for admitting their guilt.
And you brought up an important point there too towards the end, like FinTrack, who I know some folks who have worked there for a long time, and these are savvy, intelligent people doing some important work, and they have every once in a while that, you know what I mean, there's a lot of this stuff doesn't make the media. Some of the things that I know that are going on in the background, I don't have privileged information, but I get kind of 35,000 foot view just from friends who are there. These folks, and I'll include CSIS and sort of rarely maybe the RCMP even in this group, but there's folks that are doing really good work there, and there's really good intelligence, and they're really good at tracking down this money, and they're really good at, like you said, sending those warnings to these banks saying, hey, we flagged all this nefarious activity, and it just ends up going nowhere. Like one more kind of redundant example here, the super lab bust of the fentanyl lab in BC, where they like hundreds of kilograms are seized, hundreds of thousands of dollars, many weapons, and then in what's deemed to be probably a sister facility or manufacturing facility of some sort, 39,000 kilograms is what I read of precursors they seized in this fentanyl super lab bust. One person got arrested. Like it seems like to the average Canadian that might be watching this, or person who maybe is just finding out about it now, how is this going? There's no way that this isn't kind of, there's strings being pulled here from very high level people who are not just turning a blind eye to it, but probably enabling it. And the reporting that you've done, in the conversations I've had with Gary Clement and Scott McGregor's book, and all the, I'm leaving out names here, but there's so much evidence. And to the best of my knowledge, sorry, I'm getting into this end of the ramble here. It's like you do not work directly, correct me if I'm wrong, for any, as a liaison or feeding information or strategy to any Canadian law enforcement or intelligence group. Like they're not bringing you in, but you do have done stuff in the US. Is that a correct assessment?
Well, not exactly. I did recently present information to the Washington State Counter Narcotics Association. So I stood up for a keynote in front of hundreds of Washington State investigators, and it looks exactly how you'd expect. These are people that can do some heavy work if they have to go hands-on in the street, and then you got the intelligence people in there, and just amazing people that want to get after it in Washington State. So I was telling them about the lab networks that you just pointed to. I was at a resort in Idaho, and about 500 kilometers north was the Falkland Super Lab, which was, as I've reported, the largest fentanyl lab ever discovered in history, according to the US DEA, who was the one behind that whole investigation and gave all, the information on what they could to Canada and wanted to partner. And the RCMP, I think probably for political reasons, said no thanks. And at the end of the day, as you say, they went ahead, surprised their American colleagues who they didn't partner with, and busted that operation. But as far as we know, did nothing to the networks involved. And there's a low level, I think probably pretty low level Indo-Canadian guy is the only guy charged. Whereas I've reported that the people associated with that lab, which is associated with a group called the Wolfpack Alliance, one of these Canadian domestic hybrid gangs that brings together Hells Angels networks, people that know Ryan Wedding, with Iranian actors, Middle Eastern organized crime, Italian organized crime appears to be in there. So a majorly bad operation. But as I say, at the end of the day, Mexico, Iran, and ultimately China above all. And I can make those connections that, China was supplying that lab. The US government knew this, and you don't see any information about that coming out of, Mark Carney controlled RCMP. So I wouldn't like to be too cynical. Hopefully the RCMP goes farther in that case. You know how law enforcement works. If this was the Americans, they'd be flipping the lower level guy, giving him witness protection, like sending him off to Nunavut and finding out who was above him. But, cynically speaking, as you say, maybe that will go up into the levels of kind of what we see in the Sinaloa cartel has infiltrated the Sinaloa government to allow them to do their business so freely. How does Western Canada become so populated with massive synthetic narcotics labs, which are essentially like Chinese offshore drug production factories? All of the raw materials, so chemicals, all of the lab equipment, the pill presses is being shipped in from China. Some of it goes to Mexico where they set up, some of it comes to Canada's, well, it's across Canada now. And as I say, it sort of was built off all these, marijuana grows across the country. I think, back to your point, how is it happening? At the end of the day, we know there's corruption because we know that Vancouver's port, there's a lot of great police officers. I believe Neil DeBoard, former Delta police chief, has come out very publicly and testified recently about his knowledge and concerns at the Vancouver port being, a lot of organized crime, infiltration, and the port workers are only a small degree are vetted. So there's a whole bunch of people that are, I believe, vetted by the Hells Angels, essentially. So yeah, a long way to say I told a lot to the Washington State investigators. I gave them some names and some properties. if Canada doesn't do its work, I have the feeling, back to something earlier you said, the US government will not put up with what they see as a potential inbound threat of synthetic narcotics that are killing Americans coming from Canada. They'll start to they'll start to think about, I think they want to be diplomatic. I bet you they would love to work with JTF2, or trustable units of Canadian police like Alert from Alberta, or some OPP units, some Quebec units, some great RCMP officers. But I think they've got a concern that they have to get around a political will problem in Ottawa. And I'll end by saying, yeah, it does look like I will be presenting some of my findings to a Canadian police agency in the near future. So I want to hammer on that point. There's a lot of great officers, up and down, from intelligence to operators on the ground. I'm friends with some of them, and there's some great leaders, but they're not all great leaders in Canada. I don't think I'm not trying to hurt feelings. I'm just saying that at the end of the day, I think it's a political will problem, as I said.
Yeah, you hit it on the head, and I've been fortunate enough to work with some of the folks that you just mentioned that are absolutely world class, and I learned a lot from them. I'm super proud to have worked alongside them. I was always kind of happy to be the dumbest person in the room every time I went somewhere, just because there was always something to take away. There's always something to learn, and it's good to hear finally that you're being taken seriously by Canadian law enforcement and those that should be receiving consult and briefings from you. It's just kind of crazy that it's taken this long, but at least it's finally come full circle. And I know this is a bit of a hot and touchy subject here, but just for those who are listening who don't understand how accurate and how realistic these threats are, the RCMP paid you a visit many months ago to let you know what you were doing was so close to home for some of the organizations and names being mentioned that you were essentially, your life was potentially at risk. Do you mind kind of explaining how that went? If it's not too
Yeah, no, I
sharp
can
of a point.
share. I can share. I mean, I'm at a milestone. So the Bureau, my home of investigative journalism, which was built off the success of my book Willful Blindness, which kind of like allowed me to do my own thing and graduate from mainstream media and do it my way, which is nimble, deep, and rigorous. I've been at it for 3 years now, but my start was a little bumpy within, I believe, a month of operations. So it should be June or July 2023. I'll never forget it, of course, because I was asked to testify in Canada's Parliament based on my reporting at my former media employer about my knowledge of Chinese hostile state threats to Canadian politicians. I went up into Parliament Hill in my suit and testified. My first indication that all was not right was that members of the NDP wouldn't even ask me questions. So that was indicating something to me. The Conservatives, the main opposition, the opposition party, were very interested in my knowledge. Of course, one of their members, MP Michael Chan, a very, honorable Conservative member from Ontario, Halton Hills, had been essentially his family and him targeted by Chinese intelligence. And so they were interested in what I knew, but some Liberal members weren't interested. They were more interested in trying to attack my reporting, which had pointed to probably mostly their party and various individuals that allegedly were part of China's operations. So I came out from that with a little bit of a mixed feeling. I had done my duty as a Canadian. I was called to testify, and I did. I believed my information, maybe could help an official report that would come out and lead to a foreign agent registry or a racketeering law that Canada lacks. We're still waiting for those things that I advocate for. But, 2 days after my testimony, yes, INSET, which is RCMP's national security unit, knocked on the door. The fellow that talked to me was actually a lawyer with the RCMP, showed their badge and said, we have something important to tell you. And then, turned on a tape recorder and read what's called a judicially authorized warning that somehow they had gathered intelligence there was a credible threat related to my reporting on China. So a lot has happened in 3 years. I went in and gave a statement. So there's a report or reports floating around somewhere. I got the impression the RCMP had I don't have details on what this, threat meant to me. I have a certain amount of information, and as I say, I went in and talked to them, and I just have the sense that they know very well, what type of people or person could be involved. Quite possibly could be someone referred to in redacted sections of the NSI COP 2024 report, which spoke of, I'll ramble a bit here. I'm unpacking my mind on what I think I may have been alerted to. This report, NSI COP, there's 12 redacted paragraphs that refer to CSIS's knowledge of the most egregious case of Chinese national interference through a proxy that they called, this is a quote, a high harm proxy. So what I take that to mean is high harm, the type of individual that could be involved in either tasking or, directly involved in harming the lives, safety of probably Chinese diaspora members. So I don't know what that means exactly, but I know that high harm means what it means. I know that people have been hurt around the world by Chinese proxies, agents, gangsters. And so, I think if this 12 paragraphs I'm referring to, which quite likely also refers to election interference networks, transfers, clandestine money from the Toronto consulate, student voters, Canadian politicians in the Toronto area, as well as high harm activities, I have the feeling that, the warning that came to me would relate to something like that, information buried in a Canadian parliamentarian report that we'll never know it unless it's leaked, apparently. But of the type of information I believe is probably being prosecuted as we speak in the New York State with very similar networks, meaning organized crime, a lot of it from Fujian province, triads working together with covert Ministry of State Security officers that are working out of consulates. I'm speaking of a case I know in New York, and people, gangsters involved in election interference through United Front Work Department community groups, running CCP police stations, corrupting politicians, smuggling Chinese agents into the United States through United Front community leaders. So all a long way to say, I'm still here. As I told you before, I'm a writer, but no one should be confused. I know how to take care of myself. I train with a former military special operator. I'm friends with people from that world, and keep doing what I'm doing. But no one is being charged with regards to a threat to me. And as far as I know, making threats is not lawful in Canada.
Wow. It took me a second to kind of, and I knew all this coming in, but hearing it come from you is next level. And we have a few minutes left here. You brought up the NSI COP report, which is really interesting because just this morning, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled to all those heavily redacted sections that you just mentioned, to keep them redacted. The Canadian people are not allowed to know the names of the MPs who, quote, wittingly participated in election interference, allegedly. We don't get to know who these people are, and that's a specific protection enabled by the Supreme Court of the NSI COP that was brought in under Trudeau, which like, if I'm going to put my tinfoil hat on, seems like it was done to protect the PMO and the PM, and it has nothing to do with getting to the bottom of anything that's going on. And this elaborate web of pictures on a board with a lot of red lines linking all these people together, like it's like just this morning they said that no, you don't get to know who these MPs are who participated in this. That's parliamentary privilege, and you'll go to jail for 14 years if you release this name. So more and more, I hope that not that you not a told you so kind of moment, but like more and more everything you're saying seems to be becoming vindicated in real time. And it must I know I don't think you're that type of person. I really don't think you're that type of person, but it must feel pretty good to the things that you've been saying are sort of all seeing daylight in like right in front of us.
Well, I try to be somewhat biblical. That's the way I was raised. But sometimes I feel like I'm that type of person that would like to say I told you so, or would like to get in the face of some people in Canada. Look, if my work ever leads to some people in Canada being extradited, which is hard to believe would ever happen, but I believe probably should be, because if the people that are involved in these activities in Canada are essentially being protected elites or untouchable. And so I'm talking about MPs, senators, who I have been told by people on the inside that wanted to investigate them, wanted to see Canadian politicians held accountable, but were told by, the more senior and more politically connected people in their organizations, that person's untouchable. That shouldn't happen. They're being protected. And we have people in the Iranian community, the Indian community, the Chinese diaspora, Taiwanese, Hong Kongers that are facing, as I say, real threats of high harm from the people that are involved in corrupting these protected Canadian politicians. It's an unacceptable situation. So, I'm going to be going down to Washington, D.C. in about a month, and I'm sure I'll talk to people, that know the CCP Select Committee of Congress, uh, and people involved in some of the think tanks that are adjacent to U.S. law enforcement intelligence. And I'll be very happy to share with them all of the knowledge that I've gathered in sort of my travels. And most of my travels are enjoyable. Some of them do involve hardship that I've come through. And I'm doing it because I love Canada and I love the United States. I love Western democracy and our values. And I'm seeing them. We know they're hanging on a knife edge, in Canada, but they're being deeply attacked in the U.S. too. New York State, I'm learning, is saturated, I believe, in the same way from the Chinese networks that are working across the Ontario-New York border. So vindicated, I don't know, proven right, sure. Trying to be righteous. You could apply all those words, and I won't rub it in anyone's face when they do face justice. But I have to believe that the people that are being protected in Canada because they think being an elected official makes them untouchable, in my system of beliefs and values, that won't hold out forever.
Man, I still have almost another full page of notes here to go through, but we've already hit an hour.
If you want to stretch it out a little bit, we can stretch it out. But as I said, I've got something legal to attend to.
Yeah, no, I'll use that as a way to convince you to come back again, just because I've got more stuff to read and more questions, and it's always a pleasure to have you here, man. Willful Blindness is the book, folks. Check it out. Thebureau.news is the Bureau.news is the site. That's the right.
Bureau.news. Just Google the Bureau.news and you'll get taken to my site, which is now 37,000 subscribers in 3 years. So
Well
I
done.
just feel really rewarded and blessed that, the work that I'm doing is getting international traction.
Thank you so much, man. This is always a pleasure. I was a little bit nervous coming into this one just because it was the first one we did on our own, but it's always fun talking to you, man. And I hope we can do it again soon.
Oh, for sure. If you got a page of notes to cover, we'll come back pretty quick.
Sweet. Thanks, man. Take it easy.
Right.